Hey, Chief.
Good morning, everybody. Sorry for my tardiness. I got presidential candidates coming to town this weekend.
Oh goodness. Well,
Yeah,
know the feeling.
yeah.
All right. Well, we'll move as quickly as we can. We'll call the meeting to order. Um, have a lot to discuss today. A lot of important topics. About five topics. So we'll see how quickly we can move through that. I won't spend a lot of time with the introduction since we're pretty familiar with one another. I'd like to welcome Justice Earls, co-chairs, as well as the Attorney General, Josh Stein, who are here, who are always able to jump in if they need to. But we'll move right into Civilian Oversight Board. This MUG sent out some pre-read recommendations on the Civilian Oversight Board. We'll try to get her to pop up some of these items on the screen if we need to talk about that. We'll, because of the amount of things that we have to discuss today, we'll try to really stick to our 40-minute discussion on this. I know that there's a lot to say about it. This is very important. We hear it in our public comments all the time, and so we'll dive right in. So as she is placing this up on the screen.
Can y'all see the recommendations?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Sometimes it doesn't give me all the monitors.
All right. So, Ms. Smith, you can run over this, or I can, I guess, as we go down to different bullet points and recommendations.
And Mayor Coleman, I will tell you that based on our last discussion that this group had, and then based on the feedback of the task force and also the public feedback, I drafted these that I sent out earlier this week to everyone based on whatever I had been hearing from the discussions, so that hopefully we would have a place to start our discussion and perhaps come out of this with some recommendations. The need for recommendation is really just for this working group's edification. So it's, why we need this. That's not going to be part of the ultimate recommendation. So we're really looking at the recommended solution and then looking under what are the questions for this working group to consider. With respect to this topic, the things that I noted as just places to get you started talking are, what types of incidents should qualify for release of information. A large majority of this recommendation deals with revising the public records laws. And so what types of incidents should qualify for that release? Should it be all use of force, or only those involving death or serious injury, or only those where the SBI is called in to investigate? And then further, what powers, if any, does this working group want to suggest that Civilian Oversight Board should have? Should they have subpoena power? Should they be able to recommend charges to the district attorney? That kind of thing. And so here you can see some of the thoughts for the recommended solution, and I'll just leave that up while we discuss, and am available to line item edit or delete as the group feels necessary.
Okay. All right, we'll jump right in. So recommend that the Civilian Oversight Board be created at the local level in order to be responsive to communities they serve. So would this recommendation cover all jurisdictions, municipalities, and counties, or what about the smaller areas that may not have the capability? I don't know if we thought about this or talked this through, or is this just a goal for all local law enforcement departments to have, or communities to have, an oversight board?
Mayor Coleman, the reason why I put that up there is at the last discussion, this group was talking about whether there should be some sort of statewide civilian oversight board or whether it should be more at a local level. And I thought where everyone ended was that if there are these boards, they should be at the local level so that they can be responsive to their communities. And so that, as opposed to one large statewide board that would try to control oversight for the entire state. So that was what that was designed to be responsive to. I think that the question that you raised, though, if you look in conjunction with number 4, that talks about the recommended revisions. And I've made a couple changes since I sent this out to you guys, so I've tracked those changes here based on some feedback from other stakeholders. That the question, I guess, is civilian oversight boards being created at the local level. then are those boards able to gain access to the information they need? And should those boards be considered officials under the statutes I've listed? Each of those statutes allows certain officials to get copies of personnel files. And so are those officials currently getting copies of personnel files? Does that include the internal affairs investigations files? And is that what this group wants to talk about? Also, thinking about whether or not civilian oversight boards should register at the state level. I think part of the conversation for this group is whether, if you're thinking about giving access to these personnel files to a civilian board of individuals who are not employed by the municipality and therefore aren't specifically covered by the statutes for employment, because the board would not be a paid position necessarily. If those individuals are going to be receiving the files, the investigative files or the personnel files related to an IA investigation, is there some need for accountability there as to who those individuals are? Would those individuals need to register their boards to make sure that every board is legitimate, for example, supported by its county, and not a rogue board that's not supported by its county or town or citizens? And that way there would be a way to track which boards are supported by the community. And then after those boards are tracked, then those boards could theoretically be able to have the documents that they need to make the assessments that they need. And so I think it's a trickle-down question for this group to discuss.
Okay, that's a good starting point. Chief Davis, Sheriff Ingram, any insight on that? I know you all have the professional law enforcement perspective, but anything to add to that?
I will add that I do agree that if boards are established, that they should be established at the local level, because what I do find is that our board here spends a lot of time, and not just here, but previous boards that I've been involved in that at the local level, they spend a lot of time trying to understand policies and procedures that are unique to that jurisdiction. So making decisions sometimes at the state level about issues across the state might be very complicated for boards to make decisions and have all of the information that they need in order to make a fair decision about a particular case. I just sent out one of our board members a text because I wanted to ask them, and I meant to do this last week. I apologize for my dereliction of duty here. I wanted to ask them how much of a file or what have they had access to in the past. I think they've had access to certain elements of investigative files that have been redacted to some degree as well. But I wanted to make sure that I should be getting a response from them in the next few minutes. It's actually somebody in the mayor's office that sort of controls that board.
So to that point, so what I understand that the need for a local board that may know local policy. So what type of state consequences there for bad action for officers, not criminal bad action necessarily, because we understand there's a criminal process that a review board wouldn't see that. But if there was a bad actor from a law enforcement side, like I gave the example before, any other state licensing has a licensing board that can take your privileges away to do business in North Carolina or not.
As do the officers, Mayor Coleman. It's the Sheriff Standards and CJ Standards would be
that's
involved.
What they do. So do they review complaints right now?
That is correct. They have a probable cause process when there is a complaint made that there is a violation of the minimum standards of certification. It goes to the probable cause group of each agency. I think Sheriff Ingram actually sits on his PC group for sheriffs. And then if that group of individuals finds probable cause that a violation has occurred, then it comes out. And if the officer or law enforcement agent does not agree with that, they have the ability to contest that in the Office of Administrative Hearings. It goes before an OAH judge who renders a decision. That comes back to each commission for a final agency decision, which is then appealable to the Superior Court and then the Courts of Appeal. So there is a lengthy process to go through regarding discipline and decertification of officers who are bad actors, and that happens at the state level.
Okay, all right. So the local board's role would be exactly to do what if that's the case on the state side?
Actually, they're sort of designed to have an audience with those individuals who feel like an investigation that was conducted by the police department was one that wasn't fair, or the outcome wasn't fair, and it gives them an opportunity to appeal to that board to examine the case and make a ruling on whether or not they concur with the department or they don't concur with the department, and make other recommendations as to what should happen with a particular case. Sometimes the recommendations could be something as simple as, we know you sustained the complaint, but we think this officer needs to go through additional training, or this officer should be placed on some kind of probation or something, or something of that nature.
Well, I guess where I'm trying to get to is, right now I hear that cities that have the review boards are very limited because a lot of what they need to get to is protected by personnel files. Video is protected by, have to be referred to the courts, I understand, to get a court order. So with those legislative changes, if they were able to review that, if there's already a state process that sets up for bad action, what do these local boards, what are their functions, I guess is the part that I'm not understanding. What are they able to do if they reviewed a file, found out that there was a bad actor? Do they refer it up to CJ or to Sheriff's Association, or how does that work?
So they don't refer it to CJ. Maybe that is an option as well, that it could be referred to a more neutral entity, to the state. I know as we're developing what that might look like, that way it takes it out of the hands of the police department, because, that's where the angst is, that the department didn't come up with the answer that, they thought they should, and putting it in someone else's hands. Of course, that creates more labor for, our state entity. But I know that's what we're here to try to develop, a process that provides for a review outside of the police department. But as Leslie mentioned, certain instances, certain types of situations automatically go up to the state and to a larger board, especially more egregious types of incidents. Matter of fact, I think we've reviewed some things that weren't so egregious, to tell you the truth, but that might be an existing place that could be part of a process. I don't know if that helps answer your question, Mayor, but it might not be a bad idea for us to really look at the possibilities of utilizing what's already in place for civilian review boards to have some other level of oversight.
Sheriff, any comments, input on it?
Yes, sir. Good morning, Mr. Mayor and everyone else. I appreciate being a part of this discussion. I have two questions. One is, what is the real reasoning or thought process behind developing a citizen review board? What's the real reason? Mm-hmm. Is it because we don't trust the people that are in charge of that law enforcement agency? And if we don't trust the people that are in charge of that law enforcement agency, why are they in charge of it? Because you have in the concept behind the police departments, you have the mayor or manager, whatever that might be. I'm not sure of the process. And then you have a council or commission. And in the case of the sheriffs who answer directly to the people, you go through an election process. So if we don't trust the people that are in charge of the agency, because what we're talking about here is we're talking about non-criminal matters, because criminal matters, we have a very involved process already in place in the state of North Carolina to deal with those officers and ensure that there's a number of layers of accountability in place already. So really, what is the real goal of putting a civilian review board in place, other than the only thing that I can see is that we don't trust the people that are in charge of the agency, and it adds some type of transparency to the agency. And as I mentioned before, there are so many ways to create levels of transparency within an agency and open the doors to the citizens that it serves and get them involved in the agency so that they understand what's going on. In my office right now, we have community members that have come together with questions about specific things that have occurred with interactions with law enforcement, meeting with some command staff to go over that and review that. That we've had that process in place forever, but it's not a civilian review board. It's because we have conversations with our community and the doors are always open. So I guess I'm just struggling with, where do we have a breakdown currently?
Well, I think what it is, Sheriff, that's a great point. Just as a non-law enforcement person, what I think the concern is that when there's an incident, it's investigated internally through the internal affairs, which is usually their supervisor who moves it up to their next person, who moves it up ultimately to the chief on the city side. I don't know how it works on the sheriff end. That was the way I understood it. Then coupled with the fact that the state laws prohibit disclosure of how the investigation is going because it's personnel related. So you've got the law on one hand, which is a hindrance, and you've got a process that is taking place with police, basically policing police in a case of question. So I think that right now the public doesn't understand why they can't get information from it, coupled with the fact that police officers are doing the investigation on their colleagues, makes it a process that's not trustworthy. And then communities that have a review process are still prohibited from seeing certain things. So I think that is the big problem. It may not be that it's I don't trust this person as much as it is, I don't trust this process because the law doesn't allow them to tell me, but so much while it's in process.
And I understand that, but then I go back to, then I think that entity has done a very poor job of connecting with the community and explaining the processes that they go through. And time after time, when there is an issue, meeting with the community or those that have concerns and addressing those concerns to everyone's satisfaction. And we've been able to accomplish that time after time after time. And I don't see how a civilian review board is going to ultimately take away all of that concern if you still have that failure, so to speak, at the leadership end of it, to connect with the community and put things in place to reassure them, like we've done, volunteer programs, being able to bring people into the agency and be a part of the agency, finding ways to engage the community through a number of different programs. Again, I just don't see where the civilian review board, as it's described, is going to be effective at all. And in many ways, it's going to bog down the process. So that's just, I know the processes we have in place, and I see where some agencies do it really well. And I'm extremely proud to see how well they operate and how well they connect with their community and how representative they are.
So let me ask you a question. With your process, as you said, that you all have a transparent way of doing it, or some agencies do. With the current law as is, when there's an issue with an officer or a deputy, how is that investigated, and how much of that can you communicate to the public?
Okay, and let's just take for a minute that it's not a criminal matter. Okay,
right?
Because criminal matter, we know
we got a process for that.
Yes, sir. So if it's something with regards to policy, maybe a policy violation or an interaction on the street that doesn't rise to the level of a criminal matter, but more of the interaction didn't go very well. There's questions as to why a person was stopped. We have a process in place, like you described, where we have an internal affairs that investigates that. We have then a process in place where those folks can come in, and a lot of times we can allow them, many times it's on video, we can allow them to actually view the video and go over that process, sit down with us. We don't give them a copy, but we can allow them to view the interaction. And 99.9% of the time that resolves it right there, because they see exactly what occurred. And that being the person that we had the interaction with, or whoever they allow to represent them as far as viewing that video. And then we sit down and have conversations with them. And while we can't, there's certain things we can tell them and certain things we can't by law, when we explain the process and they understand the links that we went to resolve it, we've had very positive results from that. Now, are you going to please everyone 100% of the time? No, sir. And I'm not sitting here telling you that you're going to, because if somebody has figured that out, let me know. I really want that information. But I don't see how what we have in place, what we do in a lot of other agencies, I'm not just saying it's us, there's a number of agencies across the state that are really doing it well. I don't see how a civilian review board is going to make that process any better. And I don't see how it's going to make it any more transparent, because we have the doors to our agency open for people to come in all the time. Now, with regards to COVID, and, we've had to kind of redo how we are operating, but theoretically our doors are open. As I mentioned, we have someone there today discussing some matters, and we have done that time and time and again. And I just don't see how putting civilian review boards in place is really going to accomplish that. And I think ultimately agencies should be representative of the communities, and they, in a number of ways, not just with demographics, but I think we should address those needs and concerns of the communities. And we've been able to find a way to do that in our area. And I know many others have as well, without the use of another type of oversight or civilian review board.
Mayor Coleman, if I may, and to address Sheriff Ingram's point, and I don't disagree with any of that, certainly it is important for our law enforcement partners to work with the communities and all of that to go smoothly. I think that the thing that is outside of our control in this working group and our control in this task force is that the communities around the state are going to stand up these boards. It is happening right now in Fayetteville. Mayor Coleman, you know that that's ongoing. Chief Davis has one in Durham. There's one in High Point. I think there's one in Charlotte. They exist, and I think will continue to exist across the state if individual communities call for them. And that's not something that this task force can change or do anything about necessarily one way or the other. But I think that there are some important issues surrounding civilian review boards that are important for this working group to discuss. If we take for a given that they will exist in North Carolina in some communities, and that they will look different in those communities depending on what the needs of each community are and how they work with their law enforcement partners and who's deciding what that board should do, I think that we have an opportunity here to say, here are some parameters on that, and here's what we would like for those boards to be doing, and here's the information that can be available to those boards that do exist if the communities choose to stand them up. And so if you look at the recommended solution, number one is that recommending that any civilian oversight boards be created at the local level. That's not saying we recommend every local municipality to create one. It's saying that it's more appropriate at the local level than at the state level because of the nature of the beast. And so I think that's what the recommendation is saying, that working group one isn't saying to the task force, we feel like there should be a statewide community civilian oversight board, that those have to be within communities. Recommendation number two is that we recommend that any communities that do seek to create these boards look at coordinating with NACOL, because there are some best practices that they can learn from, and they do want to benefit from the legitimacy of what is a nationwide organization who has worked on these issues across the country. Number 3 is then looking at whether we want to keep track of what boards exist in North Carolina and to what extent they have policies and procedures and bylaws and are legitimate within their community, are working within their community, as opposed to being a type of organization that does not have the support of their community. Not, of course, requiring them to register before they can happen, but just saying we want to keep track of this to make sure that that adds the legitimacy that is needed when dealing with such sensitive issues like these boards deal with. And then the 4th recommendation is looking at the personnel laws. 126-3 is for state employees. 153A-98 is for, I think it's county employees, and then 160A-68 is local municipality employees. I could have those 2 transposed. And so I think then the questions are, do we want to look at a legislative recommendation surrounding what is available to be reviewed? Does that include town, city, and county councils, who sometimes, some counties, some municipalities might want the town council or the city council to be able to have this information, as opposed to setting up a separate civilian oversight board? And so what is currently available and what do we want them to consider? So I think that's what we were charged with perhaps looking at surrounding civilian review boards. I don't think that there's anything that can come out of the task force that will say, yes, you should have them, or no, you should not have them. I don't know that this group can gain consensus on that. I could be wrong on that, but I do think that we can do a lot surrounding, if they exist, what should it look like, and what should the laws look like surrounding it? And so maybe if I could drive the conversation in that direction a bit.
Right. Well, I think that's great. I think what we can all agree is that there needs to be a legislative change that allows more flexibility with what can be reviewed. I think that was one of the recommendations. So I guess we'll go down these work group members and see if we can get a consensus on moving some of these recommendations forward to the overall task force. Recommendation number 1.
Sorry, Mayor Coleman, before you, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but if I may just make a comment before you go to the point of taking up the individual recommendations. I just want to make 2 points. One, I think this discussion highlights that it might be useful to say a little bit more in the need for the recommendation section. So, I mean, that's the question that Sheriff Ingram has raised. Why do we need these civilian review boards? So it seems to me that it might be useful to address that question more fully in the initial section. And because I do think that there are members of the task force, as well as certainly members of the public that we've heard from, who do believe that there is value in having a citizens review board, and it is not necessarily tied to a complete lack of faith in a police chief or in a sheriff or in the law enforcement leadership, but that there is value to having a community, a board that is made up of diverse stakeholders in the community to address the issues that are presented by individual situations, that it's not only the particular individual and their attorney that is interested in how the policing is carried out. So, and I think this concept of having public engagement and oversight of professional entities is not completely foreign to other professional bodies. So there are a number, I'm just thinking of the Judicial Standards Commission that has a public member. So I think there is more that can be said about the need. But the second point I want to make is to remind us that the executive order establishing this task force does not require that we only put forward to the governor recommendations upon which there is consensus. While that is the goal and desirable, the executive order contemplates that there may be votes and there may be majority views and dissenting views. So I just wanted to also remind us of that.
Thank you, Justice
Mayor
Earls.
Coleman, if I could, and Justice Earls, the need, this is not meant to be the problem statement that will go in the ultimate form. This is just a working document for the group to say why we need to talk about this issue today in this meeting. So just for that, to make sure that you know that we can flesh that out certainly more fully to address all of those issues.
And before we go through the recommendations, I did get a response back from our coordinator for our Civilian Review Board, and she works out of the mayor's office. So she basically says that the oversight board, the Civilian Oversight Board, does not have access to the investigative file. But what happens is our attorney, this not the police attorney, but the city attorney, there's an attorney assigned to that board as well. And that person reveals or provided materials to share with the board about a particular incident and help to articulate department policy, any laws that might be violated, or any policies that are violated, and the specifics of a particular incident. So that's sort of the way that the process works with us. I've been here for 4 years. I mentioned it before, and I know the individuals on that board, and some of them are very, very vocal in the community. And I think this process has worked for us. I don't have my hands in the process, neither does our police officers or our investigative team. And they have been supportive of the recommendations and outcomes, the dispositions of the investigations that we have conducted. And I think they feel that the transparency is there in the manner in which we help facilitate their review. So I think that it's been beneficial for the city, for them to believe that there is some means of transparency in investigations. And I do believe too, that a lot of it has to do with the trust in the leadership, in the police department as well. I don't go out trying to protect officers that have done something wrong. Those that have done something egregious and wrong, they don't work here anymore. And that's not because of the Civilian Review Board. That's because I made the right decision, for the community and for the police department. So, this is a good discussion, but I did want to share that that's the manner in which we sort of facilitate the investigations.
Chief Davis, to that point, how does that review board work in conjunction with your internal affairs process? Does the internal affairs process happen first, or are they working at the same time? How does that work?
The internal affairs process works first. And then after they're done with the investigation, if there is a question by the individuals that filed the complaint, if they aren't satisfied with the results, then they take that complaint to the Civilian Review Board for further review.
Okay.
I can say that I think what really helps with our board is that by city mandate, every person that sits on that board has to go through the Citizens Police Academy. The Citizens Police Academy has been very beneficial for board members as they try to make decisions about, the various inner workings of police work. And it is sort of a deep dive into the internal affairs process and, use of force. They go through the simulators, they have to do ride-alongs and so on.
Okay. Yes, sir, Sheriff.
Yes, sir. I wanted to ask Justice Earls, I don't know if she's still on or not, but she mentioned judicial standards, which, I appreciate. And I think that you can actually look up somewhere if a judge has been disciplined. There may be some type of website where you or some kind of information where you can see if there's been some kind of action. But other than that, you don't even know that an investigation exists on a judge. It's not even acknowledged if it's taking place when there's an allegation made. And in that process, the information that they discuss is not public record itself. So the point I'm trying to make is that while I do believe that there needs to be a process where, we discuss where decertified officers, a website where you can go and look that up. Anyone can, I believe, if there's a name, you can type that in and see. But if we start modifying the personnel laws to enable greater access by the public, we're going to also jeopardize the interactions they have with innocent civilians. A lot of those interactions are on recordings, and it would almost be an invasion of privacy with private citizens. And if we start down that road, it's going to be very difficult to stop. And I just want to caution us moving forward. Well, again, and maybe I didn't make my point. Maybe I don't want you to think I'm completely against civilian review boards. If a community feels like they need a civilian review board, great. And as I'm sure that the chief is doing a fantastic job with hers, it certainly sounds like it. And I've never experienced one personally. And that may be the way they accomplish what they need in that area. But again, that might not be the thing that we need in our area. So I think it should be optional, but at the same time, in this discussion about public records and investigations, we need to be extremely careful because it goes well beyond just the officer we're talking about.
And I'd like to also add that I think that there is a lot of conversation, not just in our area, but around the country about civilian review boards and civilian review boards having the power to actually investigate cases. And we all know what investigations entail. And then come up with recommendations, about the investigations. I think that if we go down this road and make the recommendation, I really think that we need to help draft the scope of what a civilian review board should look like in a community, so that there isn't this thought that there's a lot of overturning of dispositions and things of that. I think that would be very dangerous, especially with people who really may not understand law enforcement procedures. And I'm not just saying this trying to protect officers. I'm just saying it because we spend a lot of time trying to explain the whys, why an officer may have responded a certain way and, what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. And we get to some very, amicable, places and conclusions. But I just think that maybe we need to, if we move down this road, talk about what the scope of that work should look like.
Yeah, that is one of the questions that we need to answer is what are the powers that we're recommending? And, so I agree. As it relates to all of this, as we look at the recommendations, because we're right up on our 40 minutes for this item, I think there's a general consensus that we see that civilian oversight boards are popping up in our local community. So one of the recommendations was to recommend that we have recommend that happens in local communities, to coordinate with NACO regarding best practices. That may give us some guidance as to to what they look like and what the expectations are. As we look at some of the other recommendations, do we have a consensus, or at least, I would say a consensus to move these recommendations forward, or do we need to go over each individual recommendation?
Mayor Coleman, before you take that vote, may I just clarify, based on Sheriff Ingram's comments, I want to make clear that I completely agree with him that there is a difference between a public record and something that is available to an oversight board or committee. And so recommendation number 4 was drafted to try to strike that balance. It is a subtle balance that you have to strike, but any statutory changes would have to ensure that the documents are not in fact public records. And so I think that one of the crucial questions that would have to be considered in drafting any statutory change is making sure that they are not public records, just like investigative records of law enforcement agencies right now are not public records. And also the drafters, when drafting this legislation, should consider the extent to which it is further able to be released. I mean, if the board is able to review but not further release to anyone else, that is certainly an additional protection on the individuals whose information is within that either personnel file or that IA. So I just wanted to draw your attention before you took the vote, those 2 provisions to narrow the scope and make sure to balance the release of information.
Okay, thank you. I think we can all agree, the NACO regarding best practices, is there agreement that that the board should coordinate with NACO's best practices and policies?
Mr. Mayor.
Yes, sir.
I think I'm okay with the language that if one is created, that they coordinate with NACO. I'm certainly fine with that. And I just want to be careful as to the way we word that, because again, I feel very passionate that each community should decide what's best for that community. And in the case of the chief and I, one community may want that type of board in place. My community may not want that kind of board in place. And I don't think that we should be giving the appearance that we're demanding that that's the way it happened. So I wanted to make that point.
You're saying to the creation of the board itself, Sheriff?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay.
And I think my edits there account for that to 1 and 2.
What'd you say, Chief?
I was just noticing Leslie's edits here that might help shape some of that recommendation.
Okay. Create it. Let's see. Yeah, I think that's it. That they register with the state to make sure they're legit. I think we all agree that's probably necessary, right?
Yes, sir. I think that any board I think that would go into the process of what Leslie mentioned earlier about they have to be registered with the state, a formal board, in order to have any access to records that may be modified in the future for this purpose.
Okay.
Only those registered.
All right. And then number 4, the allowing of inspections of certain documents. I think we've kind of hit that a little bit, but this is definitely assuming that information is redacted that could compromise or could put in jeopardy any type of investigative. So I think she captured that in this. Any recommendations to the language changes in number 4? I think we all agree that we don't need to release anything or let them review anything that'll compromise anyone's safety or investigations or so forth. So, well, it looks like we made. Now, what about the powers? What powers what are the scope of their work? Chief Davis, that's one of the things that we talked about. I think is real important. You think they should have the ability to require records by way of subpoena or make recommendations up to the state? I like the state level because, this is recommended to the DA, but if you have a state level process that is already in play, do you think a local review board should make the recommendations to the state level?
I think that would be the only way I would agree with any type of changes in dispositions that is recommended to an entity that has, the knowledge and expertise to make a neutral, to have a neutral review and provide some type of, decision, whether it concurs with the investigation or does not concur with the investigation, but not in the power of the board itself. It's just not enough, knowledge about,
Right.
Yeah.
Sheriff?
Okay, if it's going to be making recommendations to the state, we're talking about a policy violation, because again, if we go back to criminal violations, those violations are going to be handled by State Bureau of Investigation, District Attorney's Office, possibly a grand jury, and it could even go to the Attorney General's office and beyond. So do we want the state or some state entity to get involved in policy violations?
So what is the state's, if you have a process now that handles criminal misconduct through the SBI and DA's office, but you told me that you have CJ and the Sheriff's Association that are there to review officer bad conduct. What type of thing, what are they reviewing if it's not a policy breach?
They're reviewing criminal matters as well. And it could be, it coincides with the criminal investigation. So they handle that part of it. They can handle things with regards to good moral character. We have that as well. And that could be where an officer was untruthful, but doesn't necessarily rise to the level of a criminal action, but untruthful. So there really is a catch-all. And, if you talk about that board itself, it's made up of members of the community college. I think there's a former county commissioner on there, a current county commissioner. So I was trying to look that up to make sure. College reps, county commissioner. So there's a number of people involved in that process that, if we're going to appeal it to something, it would be no more than training and standards, I think, as far as looking at something.
I guess my point is that, one, we define what type of things that board looks at. They're not looking at, did he take extra time from lunch, or did he not fill out a document that he should have filled out?
Well, yeah, yes, sir. They could, because that could go back to being, I've personally heard cases where someone was working, currently working on shift and actually putting down time as if they were working another type of duty. So if it has something to do with being truthful with regards to working during lunch or not, or whatever, there are some of those cases that we actually hear.
So they do actually already hear policy violations. So that was my point. So what's your concern about a citizens review board referring things up to the state level?
Nothing, as long as they're referring it to training and standards, the Training and Standards Commission. I was not understanding what state entity we were talking about referring it up to.
And I would concur too, Sheriff. That's what I was referring to. Refer it to an entity that is familiar with reviewing those types of cases. Because as we talk about this, if it gets approved by the task force, I would rather it be approved and a process approved that is not going to be a debacle for You know, so yeah, that's exactly what I was recommending. Of course, it would need to be staffed. Sheriff, you know how many people sit on that board. It would have to be staffed to handle it.
I do, and you're exactly right, Chief. We would definitely need to make sure that these recommendations that, with the in my humble opinion, in these recommendations, we need to make sure that it's funded, because to put this additional burden on training and standards as they currently are staffed would be almost impossible for them to accomplish anything. And then that would allow for bad actors to continue operating because of the lack of efficiency that, or the amount of cases they could hear and process. So I certainly think we need to be very careful, but it doesn't need to go to any other entity other than training and standards, in my opinion, with these policy violations, Mr. Mayor. And we need to make sure, in my opinion, that that language is included in these recommendations, so it's clear as to what we're talking about with regards to these. Because where I do see the merit in a civilian review board going through a particular case, and maybe they pick up on something that they did not internally, and then they have the option to be able to review that to a higher level or authority, and that would apply across the board.
Sheriff, this is Josh.
Police and sheriffs.
I think that in addition to the commissions, I think make recommendations to the agency itself. Like Chief Davis, I assume that if the Citizens Review Board looked at what you all had done in your internal investigation and didn't think that you came to the right conclusion, they would tell you that and encourage you to sanction the officer in some way. Maybe they don't necessarily have to specify exactly what the sanction would be, but to say that this is a violation and you need to handle this.
Absolutely. And that does happen when we've had, those occasions. And as I said earlier, sometimes it's something as simple as, we think this officer needs to go through some additional training, some conflict management training or something. And, it's like a light bulb. You know what? You're right. I think that would help this particular officer in that regard. So I think that should be the first step to try to have some type of conversation with the agency. And then if the Civilian Review Board isn't satisfied with that, then there may be this other alternative to potentially come to some type of consensus. But that should be the final stop, especially on a policy violation. Once it goes to training and standards, and either they make a recommendation, and I mean, that group is a very robust group. It's not a group of head nodders. There's a bunch of going back and forth about what our positions are on different things. And I have to admit, I haven't agreed with everything, but that's what the board is set up to do.
Is that the same one for CJ and one for the sheriffs, or is it one that covers all law enforcement?
Leslie, the folks that are sitting on our board, they're mostly municipal law enforcement, right? Do we have any sheriffs on our board?
No, sheriffs are completely separate because they're constitutional officers. And so everything on CJ deals with local police. And then we also have a highway patrol, ALE, SBI, everyone else basically who's not a part of the elected sheriff's side.
Okay.
And the sheriffs handle the sheriffs, the detention officers, and telecommunicators on all telecommunicators.
Okay, so is this are these recommendations that we can get a consensus around, Sheriff? Did we address concerns that it will go to that specific Chief Davis, that specific training? What did you call it? The training.
Training and standards.
Training and standards, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And Mayor Coleman, let me just say, I added also what you guys have not yet discussed, but was one of the questions: should the Oversight Board be able to make recommendations to the district attorney? I think it's important to understand that obviously the district attorney is the constitutional actor and will be the ultimate decider of whether charges are brought in that action. But if we're recommending to agencies, now that is different, right? It's the other two recommendations, A and B, that I've drafted here are policy. violations of policy, not dealing with criminal violations. So question whether or not you want subsection C there or not at all. It's just for the discussion purposes.
So the only question I have about that is if you have a group of civilians that are not professionally trained to identify what's criminal and what's not, I think that could very well complicate something, because if they see something as a crime or that may not be a crime and they make a recommendation, then the public is going to view that as, you know, they recommended charges and the DA didn't do it, and now he's got to prove why he didn't do it, you know. And so I think that complicates this, in my opinion. If there's a process to deal with the criminal element, I think we should keep that where it is.
I agree with you, Mr. Mayor. I
do
definitely think that would complicate things tremendously, because they're already handling that process, and most often they make it known as to their reasoning why they charged or didn't charge. I mean, they make that public. So I certainly believe that's the better way to go. And I agree with the Attorney General when he made a statement that, you know, we don't need to forget in this process that these civilian review boards, the first step is to communicate with the agency head and maybe rectify that before going beyond that. I think the other thing, and I'm looking in here and I may be overlooking it, Leslie, are we going to add to these recommendations, especially with regards to these oversight boards being able to recommend or communicate with training and standards potential violations? Are we going to make sure that we encourage funding or address that issue, because we cannot add that to the current commissions without additional funding? They don't have the staffing to handle that kind of volume.
Here, here. I'm with the sheriff on that one.
I knew you would be.
Leslie, you can probably put that specifically in the recommend that contingent on funding being provided or something like that. You can just probably stick that in B. And I had a question. I know we talked about this earlier, Leslie, as you type and edit and process 100 things at the same time. I think it's appropriate that they be able to see the evidence that is not public record, but they're seeing it doesn't make it a public record. Have we addressed that issue?
So up here, the question is, if we're going to give them access to the documents, making sure that any statutory changes don't make that a public record. Yeah. I think that it comes down to the ultimate way that the changes to these three are drafted about what they can gain access to. If they can currently gain access to the personnel file, and that's what this question here is, you know, first of all, are the IA investigations, is that what we're talking about? Are we talking about the IA investigative file in its entirety, not just the personnel decision that these boards would be able to look at? Still, that does not make it a public record, just like an investigative agency's files are not a public record. So yeah. I think that is something we can specifically put in.
I think that was documents and video. I mean, they should be able to look at the video as well, but that makes sense to me.
And we do have a recommendation set for our next meeting that is to discuss the similar amendments that we would be making to the personnel laws that we would make to the law enforcement reporting release laws, which are a separate set, but would also dovetail with this recommendation.
Thanks.
Mr. Mayor, one thing I would like to add, do we want to make sure in that area that if access is granted, that there are no copies provided, it is only access, much like we have with our videos currently? You can allow them to view, but no copies. I think we need to be very careful with that.
So maybe we can treat it like closed session. You know, when we go into executive session, you're not to discuss it. You can't get any copies to be distributed. So yeah, I don't have an issue with that. How can we make sure we cover that?
So subsection D under 4D, drafters should discuss the extent, and that's the drafters of the legislation. The working group could make a more concrete recommendation here. Instead of saying that the drafters should discuss it, the working group could recommend that these documents will be made available to these entities for viewing, but they may not receive copies if that's the will of the working group to address that issue.
Chief, any input on that? Or Attorney General, what do you think about that?
I agree they shouldn't have copies. They can review the documents.
Yeah, I definitely don't think they should have copies of the documents at all.
And I think in this, if it's addressed through legislation or whatever, however we accomplish that, I would strongly recommend that there be punitive measures put in place for anyone that would release that information in any way, because that has to be protected in order to protect the integrity of this process that we're talking about.
Because they're not going to be here doesn't mean we can't do what needs to be done.
Steve said, was there another matter that she texted him, said that you want to talk to him about another matter?
So I've got here
Cases that
COBs or city, town, county councils may review the documents related to the IA investigation, but may not have copies or further release these documents or the information contained therein.
because the suspects are suspects in other jurisdictions.
Chief Davis is discussing one of our cases, and she needs to mute that. Hey, I want to mute it. We didn't want to hear anything we wasn't supposed to hear. So
I'm trying to multitask, and this is. I apologize.
Tell me about it. No, you're fine. Just didn't want to intrude. All right.
It wasn't secret squirrel.
Okay. All right. All right, guys. So I think we've had a great discussion about this. Does this capture all of our concerns?
Mr. Mayor, did we address that? And Leslie, I don't see it, and I could be overlooking it. I apologize. Are we going to mention that there's any kind of punitive measures with regards to anyone that were on these, as a member of these boards, releasing that information? That information has to stay protected. I think.
And I'm sorry if there was another change. I missed, my internet dropped, so I apologize if I missed another change. Let me know.
I was just encouraging everyone to consider adding in this somehow language that references anyone that would release this information, sitting on a part of these boards, that would release this information outside of that board, could be held criminally liable, because we have to protect this information.
Yeah.
And we cannot be careless with it. It's just like the other boards that we're a member of. And if we don't protect the integrity of it, it's going to be useless in the end.
Well,
and not a lot of other issues.
Yeah, and to that point too, we don't release a lot of this information even to internal staff about investigations at all, period. Because of the nature of some of the investigations, it could pose threats to officers, and that kind of thing. And sometimes people just think they've got some juicy information and they start sharing with folks, and it has all kinds of negative, outcomes as a result. So I agree.
To address that concern, Sheriff Ingram, if each one of these statutory provisions, 126, 153A, and 160A, they each have built in a provision that says a public official or employee who knowingly, willfully, and with malice permits any person to have access to information contained in a personnel file, except as permitted by this section, is guilty of a Class 3 misdemeanor, and upon conviction shall only be fined an amount not more than $500. So that's actually built in. And if we make these edits within those 3 statutes, that penalty goes with the edits that we make.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Other than that, we're good. All right. Well, let's just take a consensus to move these recommendations to the overall task force. Those in favor, a show of hands. All right. Those opposed, there are none, so it carries. That's good work, guys. That was a heavy lift, that citizens review.
It was.
Tight schedule that Leslie gave us, 40 minutes. So, data collection. So, Ms. Leslie, if you could present, well, we can kind of zip through this one. I may change devices so that I can move around a little bit if I jump off. But if you wanted to present this one, I'll log off of this and zoom in on my phone.
Yes, sir. And I will say that I have made one change here since I sent out to you guys earlier, number 2. I had a conversation and was talking with Jeff Welty about what Working Group 2 is doing surrounding their recommendation for data collection for use of force. So our recommendation would be meant to dovetail with that and probably ultimately be combined with the overall working group data recommendation that the task force is going to compile all together. But a couple of things to flag, and Sheriff Ingram and Chief Davis, y'all can probably speak to this. We don't want to require double reporting and put additional requirements on officers, agencies. That's a resource, but we do need to collect this data. So currently, the NIBRS requirements, when we're looking at what else to collect, we should make sure that it dovetails with that. Although another thing for us to talk about is the fact that right now there are some agencies who, due to the administrative burden, aren't able to comply with NIBRS requirements at the moment. And so that's certainly something that we want to think about in doing additional data reporting or recording. So one thing that NIBRS does not collect currently is any demographic data about the officer involved in the incident. And so it collects information about victims involved, demographic data, including sex, race, ethnicity, and resident status, and the same for victims, and the same for the arrestees or offenders. But it doesn't collect that data for officers. So query whether we would want to also collect that data, and then whether we would want to disaggregate it in these ways listed in 1A. Those came from looking at California's website. They do a large release of information that they collect. And then whether we want to make all of that be collected by the SBI, similar to the collection of the traffic stop data, and the SBI 122 is the document that does that. There could be something similar to the 122 that makes it easier. It's a checkbox. It's a little bit easier on folks than having to fill out, write reports. We're checking boxes here as opposed to that. So the thought would be, do we want to collect this data? Do we want to do it in a way similar to the SBI 122? Do we want it to go to the SBI and then further from them onto NIBRS? And also, do we want to collect data that is additional to what NIBRS currently requires collecting? The other, number 3 down here at the bottom, is whether there should be some consideration to making the above reporting mandatory. The data is only as good as the agencies that comply and the officers that comply. And I think that we've talked on other occasions about the fact that perhaps we don't have 100% reporting in North Carolina. And so right now, the only penalty for an agency that doesn't report their data is that they aren't allowed, or certain grant funding is not available to them. And does the working group want to consider whether there should be additional either incentives or consequences for not reporting the data as requested? So that's how I would set up the things to talk about here. And I just put California's website for y'all to look at. But I think that probably would set up the discussion there. And I think Mayor Coleman is not back on yet. So I don't know, Chief, if you've got any thoughts about this based on what you currently have to collect and report and the burden on your agency.
Searches unrelated to traffic stops, I think we could easily compile that. I don't think any of it is an extra burden. Detentions unrelated to traffic. Detentions unrelated. Are we talking about detentions that don't result in an arrest?
So that's why I drafted that way, Chief. California collects a lot of that data that doesn't necessarily result in arrest. So I think any detention or arrest or search that is part of a traffic stop is covered already by the SBI 122. So it's any of those things that occur outside that context that we would want to look at. And so I think detentions unrelated to traffic stops would be those that don't result in arrest. How many people are, for example, being stopped, stop and frisk kind of encounter.
Right. And actually, I do think we capture this. We do a traffic stop report quarterly anyway, and I think that's captured anyhow, because we have information about the fact that out of X amount of vehicles that were stopped, 75% of folks weren't given a citation. They were only given a warning. So we do have that data captured. I don't think there will be a problem with this because most of what's listed here, Leslie, we already capture.
And I think it would just be formalizing. Now, Chief, when you capture it, do you currently capture the demographics of the officer as well as the person who is either detained, arrested, searched, stopped?
We only capture the demographic of the officer on our use of force data reports. So that would be, another category that we would have to, design or develop in order to populate it to capture that. My question to that is sometimes I try to keep up with the demographics of law enforcement in the state of North Carolina, and what kind of picture would that reveal? What type of message does it send when the majority of your law enforcement officers are Caucasian? And I mean, what kind of context can you put behind the data that comes from that? I mean, if you say you have more white officers that are actually making traffic stops than you have black officers, is it because you got more white officers in law enforcement in the state of North Carolina? So sometimes capturing the demographic information doesn't really tell an accurate story. And even with our traffic stop data, sometimes the data's there, the numbers are there, but some of the qualitative information surrounding the data isn't shared about traffic stops sometimes. So just wanted to put that out there.
Is there an edit that you would make, Chief? Because this is really just standard. What data should we gather? It doesn't say what we should then do with it or how we should qualify it. Is there other data that you think might help better tell that story? Because I do think that's an important point.
Sheriff, any thoughts on that? I'm lobbing to you.
I understand. You're exactly right. It does not paint a very accurate picture when you're trying to look at the demographics as we're talking about it here. I think, in all fairness, if there's information that we're looking to collect, it does not matter what race or gender the officer is. We're looking at the other side of that equation, but to collect the race and gender will create more questions than provide answers with regards to the officers.
I agree.
And the other thing that concerns me greatly is that, and I know you have it under 2 with regards to NIBRs and how you're reporting that, and that it needs to be coordinated with the SBI. But currently in our data system and our RMS system, and Chief, I don't know what you use. We use Zerker, and it's gone to Central Square or something like that now. But what we report to NIBRs is really not nearly as much as we capture internally. So we have quite a bit of data that they don't require. And then if this was to be enacted or required of us, we would have to do this separately, because I don't know that we're going to get NIBRs to capture all of this information that we're recommending. And that concerns me, because even though we have resources in it as a larger agency, we could not keep up with that amount of required reporting because it would be duplicate. And that, I don't know how we get there, but we need to make sure that it is consistent. So there's only one entry in the end. And back to the other question, I do not see where collecting the race and gender of the officer is going to paint an accurate picture.
And Sheriff Ingram, I'm by no means the expert in this, and I think that there are people at the SBI who would be much better qualified to speak to this. But one thought is that we have the SBI 122 here that is currently a pretty user-friendly format, and that if we decided to collect the other types of data, what we could look at doing is, instead of creating a much different process that's more onerous, perhaps the SBI 122 could be modified so that it could be for traffic stop or detention, or that kind of thing. It would capture all of that in one place, so it wouldn't be an additional burden on officers. I think that.
And I didn't mean to interrupt you. I agree with that, though. I think we could certainly modify that, and as long as we didn't have to go beyond that, because I know there's a lot of conversation about different databases and searchable and all of this, and I just don't want to see so many additional burdens placed on local law enforcement when we're already spread thin as it is, with regards to the administrative side, because that's what a lot of this falls on in the end.
I think that's right. The conversation that we had with the SBI in getting ready for this meeting seemed to indicate that the center is considering all these issues and the data collection and the aggregation. So it really would be local law enforcement agencies reporting to the SBI, who would then be the ones gathering and collating the data at that point.
Ms. Leslie, are you saying to the FBI or SBI?
State Bureau, S as in state.
Okay.
Because the state center was created as a part of what we were doing here in the governor's order. So the state center is moving forward with their with their coordination and development and that kind of thing. And so I think that this would dovetail there.
And I'm sorry I jumped in as I was transitioning devices, but a lot of this is already reported with the police stops and the demographics of the persons and the searches. What was the sheriff's concern about duplication? Was it something additional we were asking, or what was that part of the discussion?
Two main issues, Mayor Coleman. One is that both chief and sheriff believe that we don't need to collect the race and gender of the officers, because that would create more questions than it would answer, given the fact that there's a lot more context that would need to be received with that information. And then the other is that currently the reporting to NIBRS is extensive, even though it's not 100% in North Carolina, because agencies, it is an administrative burden on agencies, but that we would try to make this as user-friendly as possible so that we're getting what we need for the NIBRS reporting, and that's being sent to the SBI, but also we could gather this data in a similar way that wouldn't require that much additional reporting. So I think my understanding is that chief and sheriff are satisfied with that, but please correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah. Not to belabor this conversation, but I tell you what has been useful for us, and instead of just collecting traffic data and traffic stop data, we started collecting the data, the actual disposition of the stop, which told a much broader story about the traffic stop, weapons or felony charges as a result of the stop, or mechanical failures on a vehicle were a large majority of our stops. But out of the stops, like 80% of the people were just given warnings. So when you just talk about, we stopped 1,000 cars for, some type of mechanical failure, it gives the impression that the police are targeting a particular community. If they were really targeting and really imposing egregious actions, then they would be ticketing those individuals, as opposed to just, saying, ma'am, did you know your tag was expired or whatever, and letting people go. That's the part of the story that doesn't get told about traffic stop data. So, and I'm not saying it's important to add anything, but when we start looking at data, I think it's important for the entire that more context be put into the results of data crunching, as opposed to just letting it tell its own story.
And so then I think the question. Sorry, go ahead, Marilyn.
No, I was saying, so I do agree with that about the race of the officer. The only question I have is what from a professional law enforcement perspective, what are we missing that is able to flush out or to be a monitor of racial profiling by officers? What are we missing in these reports that you think from a professional standpoint will capture that concern?
Well, internally, and I'm only speaking for my department, internally, we capture the data per officer, as it relates to their traffic stops. And there's a threshold. If an officer has stopped X amount of vehicles in a particular community, a particular demographic or whatever, then it doesn't mean the officer did anything wrong, but it does trigger to sort of monitor, what kind of stops were these? Was this on a particular corner? Where does this officer work? Is he a traffic officer? If he's a traffic officer, then that's what he's supposed to do every day. And some of that isn't told, in the data. So I don't know how deep, we can go with crunching data. I think departments have to be responsible for trying to monitor. And I don't know if that needs to be the statement that every police department should capture data that has triggers to identify when officers are, executing their duties in a way that's discriminatory or impartial or not impartial.
So I mean, I like that. Sheriff Ingram, anything on that front?
Yes, sir. I agree with the chief, and I definitely think that what we have in place and adding this recommended additional information will certainly help law enforcement agencies monitor what's going on within their agency, even if they don't have a system such as the chief does or other agencies to even drill down beyond that, and will give you a really good idea of what is occurring within that agency. So I think this will certainly accomplish what we're talking about.
Yep.
Okay, well, I think that is the ultimate goal. I mean, I just wanted to make sure that we were not missing anything. I do like Chief's recommendation. So if I'm Officer Coleman, you can look, you have a database of people that I've stopped. And if it shows that I've stopped 90% of one race or another, that you're able to see that. Not necessarily saying I was wrong, but you're able to see my activities is what you're saying.
Absolutely.
And so, Chief, is that a change to this, or is that something that is really already collected? It's just a recommendation that folks start looking at things in that way. I think
it's just a recommendation, because if you're extracting this much data, you should be able to see, in your department where there may be some disparities.
I like it. So are we, do we have a consensus that we'll move these recommendations forward for data collection?
I'm trying to capture, Mayor Colvin, the last last recommendation, moving that. The other thing, though, that has not been discussed is whether the working group wants to make this mandatory and include any other penalties for failure to comply on the part of agencies. Right now, the only penalty is a loss of certain state grant funding. And so that's a question for y'all to discuss.
How does that relate to non-compliant agencies with their accreditation? That seems pretty important to departments. How does this relate if I don't or wouldn't follow these steps? Is my accreditation impacted, or how does that work?
It absolutely is. There are guidelines with CALEA as it relates to capturing data and setting guidelines for police departments to be able to identify where there may be, communities that are over policed, so to speak, or if there's disparate treatment, in certain demographics. So it aligns, having these guidelines aligns with accreditation. And I know the state is working on an accreditation process, and I'm sure some of this will be built into that.
Yeah, I agree, definitely. And I think that it needs to be, I'm not sure, I do have a booklet, Chief, that they've put together, a proposed start for this accreditation process, but I don't know if that's in it or not, but I'm sure that that's some conversations we can have moving forward to make sure that it does affect that as well, beyond the grants, as a way of encouraging compliance.
Yep.
So by leaving this the way it is, just saying that it should be mandatory to include real penalties, I think that it's looking at the next step in our phase of the task force. We should look at that as part of the implementation phase. Are you comfortable with the language as it is, or do we think we need to add anything to it?
Penalties for failure to comply. So when you say penalties for failure to comply, would that be penalties related to the accreditation process?
Could be, Chief. I would again say that I'm probably not the expert in that, and I don't know what penalties could be levied against an agency who just completely fails to comply with these requirements.
Okay.
I think it needs to drill down a little bit beyond that, in my opinion, because that is really open-ended. Who's going to be penalized? Is it going to be the chief or sheriff? Is it going to be the agency as an entity? I mean, I'm a little concerned about that.
And so what would you suggest, Sheriff Ingram? For agencies who fail to comply, real penalties for agencies who fail to comply?
See. Yes, I feel better with that, definitely. Thank you. Chief, what's your thoughts on that?
I'm good. Okay. I agree.
So Mayor Coleman, I think with that, I think we are ready for a vote.
All right, so all those in favor, hands or aye, I guess. I'm not looking at the full screen, so I can't see it. So maybe we can just, so we'll do aye. So Sheriff Ingram?
Aye.
Chief Davis? Okay, and aye on my end, so motion carries.
Okay, the third recommendation is regarding psychological evaluations. And I'll preface this with, this group started talking about it, and we started talking about how we feel about what should happen. And in our very first meeting, we talked about this, and that the fact that it's not currently required under the Sheriff Standards rules, but it is for CJ. An extensive advisory group out of the Criminal Justice Standards Commission has examined this, and this is quoting their findings. This is coming up before the Planning and Standards group this November. And so the question is whether this working group wants to in any way make a suggestion to the Planning and Standards Committee as they consider this. I think at the time we first thought about it, we weren't sure where this was in process, who was taking a look at it, but now the advisory group is reporting out, it's going to a commission, and if there can be changes, the commission will then be able to make them. And then similarly, the Sheriff's commission will be able to make any changes as well. So the question is whether you want to look at this and whether this is a priority here, or whether we want to let that play out in the commissions, whether this working group wants to make a recommendation to the commissions, which I think is the only action available to this working group and the task force.
Well, I know that this was something that Representative Geller was real passionate about. He brought it up. I definitely think that it's something that needs to be monitored. I respect the fact that CJ is working on that, but does this impede their ability to do whatever they're going to do by us making a recommendation to incorporate it?
It doesn't impede. It would be us recommending to CJ that they continue to look at this issue. The other thing we could do with this, Mayor Coleman, is table number 3 here regarding psychological evaluations until Representative Galliard's able to be here, so that he can weigh in on that, and we can move on to 4 and 5, which I think are things that we could resolve in the time we've got left. And I'm happy to just take this out of this set of recommendations and move it to our next set of discussions. It's still all accountability, if that is amenable, if y'all are amenable to that.
I'm certainly in favor of tabling it. What do you think, Chief and Sheriff?
I absolutely think it should be tabled. And I also think that we should have somebody from that has an HR background, a personnel HR background, especially for existing officers where we're making recommendations, say for instance, every 2 years. I tried to get in this conversation the other day, and I know it could be a lengthy conversation, but for officers who are not under any kind of investigation, who have done an excellent job, they go to a psychological evaluation because this is their every 2 years. And the staff psychologist comes up with a recommendation that I just don't think this guy is suited for police work anymore. What do you do with that? And is a municipality wanting to go through litigation, employment litigation about a recommendation from a clinician like that? I just wanted to put that out there because we would need to really know, what we're getting ourselves into when we're talking about, starting something. And I'm not saying it's a bad idea. It's just that I think it needs to be well thought out about what that process would be.
Sheriff, any thoughts?
I agree with the chief. I think that it's certainly something we need pre-employment, and we need the ability to be able to do that as needed when officers experience certain things or go through a traumatic incident. But to arbitrarily say every 2 years or every 3 years randomly, I think it's going to be extremely costly. This is not cheap. It's going to be very problematic with ensuring that all of these officers get on a rotation to just do that. And ultimately, there are things built in, such as we discussed before, early warning systems that would help monitor and allow us to, if needed, put somebody through an evaluation. But I just think we need to be very careful, and I'm in favor of tabling it to discuss it. But I know that, Sheriff's Training and Standards is looking at this, and it's something that's very pressing with Training and Standards and with the Sheriff's Association. We believe in it, but how it looks moving forward, we need to be very careful, and I agree with what Chief said.
Okay, well, maybe we can table it. I'd like to maybe once we start discussing it, hear about some of those things that the departments have that are kind of triggers to let them look a little more carefully at an officer to be able to identify problems early on. But that's a discussion we can have, and I definitely want Representative Gallagher to be a part of it. So maybe we can get a motion to table this, and we'll move to the next item.
I move that we table this item until further discussion.
Second.
All right. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Thank you.
Okay, recommendation 4 is looking at recommendations regarding the investigation and prosecution of officer-involved use of force incidents. There has been a lot of feedback provided from the task force members and also from the public that there should be a standardized entity who investigates use of force incidents. So this recommendation takes a stab at what that looks like. This is certainly open to your edits, but essentially would require that the State Bureau of Investigation be designated to investigate all use of force incidents. And then we can tweak this language. I tried to take a stab at it based on what the feedback has been thus far, that those include officer-involved shootings, regardless of whether they result in death, other use of force incidents which result in death, sexual assaults by law enforcement officers, and all officer-involved in-custody deaths. So there are a lot of in-custody deaths that do not involve officers. For example, if inmates in jail got into a fight or something like that, that would not necessarily involve an officer, but officer-involved in-custody deaths. And that then, of course, if the SBI were involved in any of those types of interactions, there would need to be an agency to investigate the SBI. So the recommendation says that those should be handled by a neighboring out-of-state equivalent, for example, SLED in South Carolina. And that, of course, it would require budgetary increase to the SBI in order for them to be able to handle all of these cases. And they would have to generate the calculations that would need to be supported in order to make sure that they have the staff and manpower to handle the increase in investigations. Right now, currently, and I think Chief and Sheriff, you know this, but for Mayor Coleman's benefit and anybody else's benefit, right now, the SBI investigates at the request of, and so they are requested by a chief or a sheriff to investigate a case. This would not change the ability of a chief or a sheriff to call in the SBI in any situation in which they felt they needed it for some other reason, for a public corruption reason, or for a conflict reason, or for any other reason that a chief or sheriff felt they needed to call the SBI. And it doesn't take away that power. This just mandates that when it is an officer involved, not just for a shooting, that the SBI is in fact that entity who investigates. I realize now that the majority of agencies probably already call in the SBI, but there are some who do not. And so this would be a change in that way. And then the second part of the recommendation is that on the prosecution side, who is going to handle those cases at the statewide level? And so that it would enact a statute that requires the appointment of a special prosecutor to handle all of those cases. And that would be either a member of the Attorney General's staff pursuant to the statute there, an ADA from a neighboring prosecutorial district, or an attorney from the Conference of District Attorneys. And again, legislation should contemplate the increase in funding for that purpose, because right now, again, a district attorney can call in the AG's office or the Conference of DAs, and that is at their request, but it's not mandated in each of these cases. So even if you had an outside agency investigating, you wouldn't always necessarily have an outside prosecutor. It's very much at the request of the official. So that's the setup for discussion.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes, sir.
I cannot agree with number one, the very first sentence. Enact a statute requiring that the SBI be designated to investigate all officer-involved use of force investigations. I think that's what that stands for, in which local law enforcement officers from another state agency are involved. So you're talking about any time that we deploy a taser, you're going to have SBI come in and investigate? Or
no, sir. No, sir. It's as defined there. So it would be any officer involved shooting, whether or not it's a death, any other officer involved where there is a death, a sexual assault committed by a law enforcement officer, and any officer involved in custody death. So it's mostly where death results, but any shooting and then sexual assaults by a law enforcement officer. So it's narrowed to that subset.
And I agree with that completely, but that first sentence, unless I'm just looking at it wrong, it leads me to believe that it's all uses of force, and we need to change. I would humbly recommend we change that first sentence.
Maybe
as defined below.
Yeah. The following use of force type incidents, because you're only talking about those specific incidents there.
Yeah, yes, and I certainly agree with the way the rest of it is worded.
Okay, any other changes, Chief?
No, I'm good.
Okay. All right, so if we've made the amendments that address the sheriff's concerns, I don't have an issue with that. Is there a consensus to move this forward?
I'm fine with it. I know the budget isn't ours, but this has heavy budget implications on one end too.
It does, Chief, and we spoke with the SBI about this and ran some questions through their general counsel's office, and of course, that was a concern of theirs as well. And we indicated that we would have to put in any recommendation, an increase in their budget to be able to even begin to handle this.
Yeah, because the response time on investigations through the SBI already is at least 6 months on an officer involved shooting, and sometimes longer than that. So I'm glad you all had that conversation, Leslie.
And any changes to the prosecutorial recommendation? All right, hearing none, Mayor Coleman, I think we might be ready to vote.
Liz, I have a question, and I know I'm just facilitating this in on the background. I have a question. There's a part of the first line that says from another state agency are involved change anything? Like, I'm just curious as a observer and also a citizen. I'm just curious as if somebody from another state comes in and has a use of force, is that something that should be reviewed, or is it just because we don't know their standards and things like that? I'm just curious as to how that.
Michael, are you meaning, so the reason why I said another state agency is because local law enforcement doesn't quite cover every agency. We've still got Highway Patrol, ALE, and then there are other sworn sections of folks out there. There are sworn agents at the Secretary of State's office, and although less likely that they would get involved in one of these things, it is still theoretically possible. So that was what it was intended to cover. Now, are you suggesting someone who came from out of state, crossed into North Carolina, and then there was an incident that occurred in North Carolina with an out of state officer or agent?
That's what I interpreted it as. So that's why I asked the question. I'm sorry.
And I can see where that could have been interpreted that way, because another state agency might imply another state, like a state other than North Carolina. Yeah, there you go.
Thank you.
All right.
Flow. I just wanted to
No, that was a good catch. That was a good catch. So I think we are in agreement with the overall concepts of this, from what I'm hearing. And so if that is the case, can we get a motion to move this to the overall task force as a recommendation?
So moved to the task force for a recommendation.
I'll second it.
Thank you. Thank you, Sheriff. I know you were
It's just
looking at it.
It's just me and you, Sheriff, right now. Okay.
That's right.
This is
I know.
This is a significant budget impact, and so I'm struggling with that.
I know.
Well, we know this doesn't mean anything without money. I mean,
yeah.
So
I was struggling with it too. I said, okay, that's some serious money. Yeah.
Well, we all right. So thank you all, and those in favor. There's a motion to move forward. Those in favor, Aye.
Aye.
So,
I think we're losing him.
I think so.
Chief Davis.
Mayor Coleman, are you there? I think we passed it. I think everybody said aye.
Sheriff Ingram.
There we go.
We did.
Okay. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
All right, Ms. Dismuke. Okay, you can move to
All
the
right,
next
so the
item.
last one is recommended statutory changes to the no not warrant provisions. Now, under the recommended solution here, the edits are not well, they are my own, but they are, I sent them to you in this format. They're track changes about how the statute would read. So I've reproduced the entire statute there and then tracked the changes that would be proposed for your consideration. And the main difference is that in this statute, subsection 1 deals with the knock and announce rule. And then if you knock and announce, when can you then go in if there's a delay and if you don't get a response? And so the change there is to change the officer's reasonable belief to has probable cause to believe. And that is to raise the threshold in an officer's mind that they believe that they have probable cause to believe that their admittance is being denied or unreasonably delayed. And then the second change, subsection 2, is commonly referred to as the no knock provision. And currently it reads, the officer has probable cause to believe that the giving of notice would endanger the life or safety of any person. So you can enter in without knocking and announcing if you believe that. Most agencies, in my understanding, before they intend, if they believe that they are going to be in a no knock situation, they'll try to build that into the search warrant and actually specifically use that language and get a judge to specifically bless that. However, it's not required by the statute that happens. So while I think it's common practice that agencies are currently doing that and having a judge bless a no knock, it is not in the statute that the judge has to. So this requires the judge to have essentially blessed it as part of the search warrant that the agency is seeking. And subsection 3 would be to add in a definition of what unreasonable delay is in subsection 1. So what is an unreasonable delay? And I think that would require a little work and research and talking with folks, but I think that the ultimate legislative recommendation could deal with that, just knowing that we want to define unreasonable delay, looking at what the case law currently says, looking at what is commonly understood current practice, that kind of thing. And then the question for y'all to also consider is, should a second recommendation under this solution allow local jurisdictions to completely ban no knock warrants? So as you know, a local jurisdiction can be more restrictive than the state, just not less restrictive, just like the state can be more restrictive than the federal government, et cetera, as it relates to specific things. So we can certainly regulate more at the local level if we want to. And should the second recommendation be to allow local jurisdictions to do that if they so choose?
Mr. Mayor?
Yeah, yes, sir. Sheriff.
Well, I think we should be very strict with regards to no knock, as they're referred to. I want to caution everyone, because there are situations where we may have a hostage situation, and announcing our entry could jeopardize the life of an innocent person. Those situations are real. We have dealt with those ourselves. And I dare say a lot of agencies across this state over the years have dealt with those situations. And we're in the business of saving lives. And if we word this as I see it, unless I'm overlooking something, we would effectively eliminate our ability to do that in an instant. And sometimes it takes split-second decisions in order to save lives. So again, don't get me wrong. I don't think that we should have unregulated ability to do no knocks. I'm not a fan of those. Never have been, but to take away our ability to be able address something such as a hostage situation or other issues like that, it could even end up in a school shooting situation, could be very problematic and cost innocent lives.
I agree.
Isn't this only in the context of where there's a warrant? I mean, if you come across a crime scene or an ongoing crime, and you know that somebody's being kidnapped, would it, for the school, I mean, would you need a warrant to go in that instance?
You wouldn't necessarily in an active shooter situation, but it could, if you end up in a situation where you have a barricaded subject and you're negotiating with that person. There's a number of issues that I see where it could evolve into something that you had to make a split-second decision. You could be going on a warrant itself, and things unfold that were not anticipated, and have to make a decision on whether to enter without notice or not. I think we need to be very cautious about eliminating that ability.
But does number 2 give us that probable cause to believe that giving of notice would endanger the life or safety of any person?
Well, at the end of that, it has received previous approval by a judge.
Yeah, that's the part that ties your hands.
That's right.
So in a situation like that, where officers are going on a warrant, and say, for instance, a family member's inside, a spouse is inside, and is screaming, he's got a gun, he's going to kill me, or something like that. I see this happen quite often in domestic kinds of situations too. And because you don't ever know what you're going to run up on. You might be there for one thing, and as the sheriff said, something else unfolds. But adding the "and has received previous approval by a judge" keeps an officer from being able to deal with the situation or neutralize a situation without going to get approval from the judge.
Well, how do we deal with this situation? I mean, we're all thinking about Breonna Taylor, right? Like, yep. There was nothing exigent there. There was no concern about the life of them. And they had gone to get a warrant from a judge. How do we make sure that those people, or should we rule out no-knock warrants and anything other than certain types of cases? Or like, how do we prevent that from happening? Because I think that's what we want to get done.
I think that you know, number 2 really allows you to save the life of another person, the safety of another person, save the life of another person, worded as it is. And officers will have to articulate that. They'd have to articulate the probable cause that made them believe that somebody was in danger. In Breonna Taylor's situation, I'm not trying to be the Monday morning quarterback here or anything, but I don't know that the probable cause existed for the officers to believe that somebody's life was in danger. And as I said, I can't, Monday morning quarterback that because I don't know all the details. But I know exactly where you're going with this and what the intent is, because I don't subscribe to no-knock warrants, myself. I just don't want a situation to arise where we could potentially save a life and officers are already trying to, stay out of trouble. Do I go in or do I not go in and help this person? So what that language should be.
Is what we're looking at saying here, is it that we want to be explicit that we don't believe that no-knock warrants should be able to be used in situations like the Breonna Taylor situation? And so we want to be clear about that. but that we also want to preserve the ability of an officer to do what they need to do in the moment. Could that be fixed by, instead of adding at the end of number 2, receiving previous approval by a judge, adding at the beginning of number 2, no knock warrant, something like no knock warrants are disallowed except when, and then, and that basically states the disfavor except for in this circumstance. And it is different in looking at the statutes in the Breonna Taylor case. The statutes there were much different than what we have in North Carolina.
I have a
More
question.
permissive.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yes, sir. Go ahead, Sheriff.
Do we have any information as to how many issues we've had in North Carolina with our statute as it's currently written with regards to no knocks and issues occurring from that?
I don't think so, Sheriff. My anecdotal evidence from speaking with folks at different agencies is that typically, on the whole, officers probably know if they're walking into a situation where they might need to knock and announce for someone's safety. And so if they know that ahead of time, they'll actually write it into the search warrant and get the judge to approve it, which tends to immunize the officer a little bit because they have stated that probable cause to a judge ahead of time. But I can't think of anything that comes immediately to my mind where there has been a particular issue like in the Breonna Taylor case that we've had in North Carolina. It doesn't mean that there hasn't been. I just don't have any evidence that there has.
I don't recall in my years of it either, but I was just wondering if anybody else had heard and how that unfolded, so we could potentially address it that way. But again, as the chief said, and as I've said earlier, I'm definitely not a fan of no knock warrants, but I do not want to see law enforcement's ability taken away from them as an option in order to save lives. And that's what it boils down to. And so many situations can unfold quickly where we would need that ability. And definitely in the end, it needs to be articulated well. And for those who would violate it, they need to be held accountable. But we could be potentially setting law enforcement up for failure and cost innocent lives in this situation if we're not very careful.
All right, guys. So, Ms. Leslie, I guess you're making the edits to that.
Mayor, Mr. Mayor, could I add one more thing, sir?
Please. Yes, sir.
Is it possible that we table this to the next conversation and get a little bit more information? And maybe the chief and I can reach out to some of our counterparts as well and bring back a little bit more information.
I'd love to do that, particularly with your question about how many incidents we've had that this is a problem. You know, a lot of times national discussions make it to our neighborhood and it's not a problem in our community. But I'm certainly for tabling it because I think this is important. And I'd like to have as much information as we can about it. Chief, what do you?
I'm definitely not trying to drag it out, but I do think it's important that we get this right.
I agree. I think I'd like to look at the current statute as well. Probably should have done that before this meeting.
And Chief, this is in its entirety. The blue is added, but
okay,
this is the entire statute.
Okay.
And so it is just for your, as the Attorney General pointed out, it is within the search warrants subchapter. So when we're talking about entry by force, it is entry by force during a search warrant because it is in that subchapter. And then the other thing that I would flag is I did change the edit for number 2 to take out the language about the judge. It can still be put back in when we reconsider that, but whether this is more along the lines of something that would both state North Carolina's preference against no-knock warrants, but also allowing officers to use it if they need to save lives with probable cause.
Mayor Colvin, this is Jasmine. I just wanted to add one other point, that question down at the bottom is not just academic. That's one where local jurisdictions have expressed an interest in being able to make a local decision here, and they're not able to under current state law. So as you consider this next time, I wanted you to have that context as well.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you did. This was a part of the 8 can't wait that we discussed, I think. And so, yes, we were looking to modify it locally, but you're saying right now statute prevents that from happening.
Correct.
Okay, that's definitely good to know. Yes, ma'am.
And that was just, that's another issue that has come up locally, I think around the country, but that broader conversation that the sheriff and I are having, I don't know anybody that will want to be in a situation where something was happening in their home and an officer felt prohibited to go in and provide the level of, aid in that situation. And I really just don't think that when some of these recommendations come up, that aspect of police work is realized. So whatever we hang our hat on is something we're gonna have to live with.
Yeah.
Mr. Mayor?
Sheriff,
I'm losing him. Am I the only one?
I said, Sheriff, you had something?
Yes, sir. I would like to make a motion that we table this until our next meeting.
Okay. So, Chief, is there a second on that?
There's a second, yes.
Okay. There's a motion and a second to table this item to the next meeting, and we will work in between meetings to bring back additional information. So, all those in favor, I guess, aye. So, Chief Davis.
Aye.
Sheriff Ingram.
Aye.
And Mayor Coleman, aye. So, items tabled. Ms. Leslie, do we have another item?
No, sir. So just to set up for everyone the next steps, these 3 that we've approved today, recommendations 1, 2, and 4, those will go out in a poll, full task force. And like with the other polls that you've received and the feedback that we've gotten, once I get the feedback from that, I will make any changes that we think are substantive that need to go into the recommendations, and we'll send them out back to this working group to make sure that we have your sign off on those changes. And if so, then that will go to the full task force at the November 6th meeting. Our next meeting is next Thursday. And so hopefully by the beginning of next week, I'll be sending out to you something similar to this document for our next set of topics. And the topics for next week, reconsidering the ones that we've tabled, but also we need to address body cameras. And so I think importantly, and Chief and Sheriff, I'll ask you to give some thought to this ahead of the discussion. It will be what level of mandated body camera do we want to have? But there will also be a larger discussion about the body camera statutes that currently I have pulled up here, the law enforcement agency reportings, amending those statutes similar to what we did today with the public records laws to allow access for these things to civilian review boards, town and city councils, that kind of thing, like we did today with the civilian review boards. There are 2 different sets of statutes. So what we did with the personnel file statutes today, we're going to need to look at for the law enforcement agency recordings and discuss that. And then we'll be talking about asset forfeiture. We have a presenter who's prepared a video, about a 15-minute video, and we can either watch that at the beginning, although we are short on time, so I can send that out ahead of time, and everybody can watch that and read the white paper that he's going to prepare to talk about changes to the asset forfeiture laws. And then also on tap for next week, again, another big week, are recommendations to the standards commissions. And when we say that, we have done a lot of recommendations thus far that our working group and the task force are recommending the standards commissions look at things. But this will be recommendations to the standards commissions to look at things in the area of minimum standards and decertification. So accountability type issues that we haven't yet addressed. And so I'll send out some of that ahead of time so that you can read the administrative code provisions that currently exist, and we can determine whether we want to make recommendations to the Standards Commission that they conduct their rulemaking and take a look at that again to see if they want to change it. So that's what's on tap for next week. And I'll get all of that out to you by the beginning of the week, but I did want to let you know the poll would be coming out, and I'll need your feedback on that probably this week. By close of business tomorrow, hopefully you'll respond, and then by Monday, I'll get your feedback on the poll. But that's it. So I think that's all I've got, Mayor Coleman. Did we lose you?
Yeah. All right. Well, anything else, Chief or Sheriff? I think we moved pretty good today. We moved a lot of important things forward, and we have some good follow-up information that we anticipate receiving on mental fitness and the other things that we've discussed. No knock warrants and the other things. If that's it, I guess maybe a motion to adjourn and see you guys next meeting.
All right. So moved.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care.
Mm.